Hello, and thank you for joining me as we look at the changes in the new protocol version 3.0. The protocol was updated from version 2.0 to version 3.0 that we might provide some updates due to the following. One is updates that changed the eligibility criteria to help with recruitment. A second was to add an additional change to the eligibility to ensure the participant is actually taking buprenorphine before they are randomized into the study. We clarified how to manage dose increases, updated some information on how to manage study medication discontinuation, put in some clarification notes for key study roles, made some clarifications regarding some of the study assessments, and we updated the statistical plan. We'll look at these further in just a moment. First, let's look at the changes to inclusion criterion number 3. There are two of them. The first is we have changed the time that someone can be on bup prior to randomization from within 7 to 28 days to within 7 to 35 days. Secondly, we added the requirement that participants who are prescribed transmucosal bup must have at least one urine drug screen positive for buprenorphine prior to randomization. A couple of CRFs had to be updated in order to accommodate these changes due to Amendment 3. The first is the ENRC, or the Eligibility and Randomization Form. Under number 3, you can see that the 28 has been changed to a 35 and that the requirement for the positive bup urine drug screens has been added at the end. The change from 28 days to 35 days was also reflected in the updated pre-screen interview form. Now, why did we make these changes? Well, for the change from 28 to 35 days, we need to think about recruitment. Recruitment, as you know, has been off to a slow start. The protocol as written allows recruitment from non-site clinical programs located in the same region as a study site, and it is likely that sites will have to recruit from other programs and that the required documentation, that is, the documentation of receiving bup, including the dose and the start date of the current treatment episode, will take longer to obtain for these external clinical programs. To allow the time needed for that, we are changing the definition of being newly initiated on buprenorphine from 7 to 28 days to 7 to 35 days. Why did we include a new requirement for a positive urine drug screen for buprenorphine? Well, this revision was prompted by a recent screening case in which a participant, despite having a verified prescription for transmucosal buprenorphine, tested negative for buprenorphine on the urine drug screen, and they were never able to give a positive urine drug screen for buprenorphine before the time ran out for them to be randomized. We need to make sure that participants who are randomized are actually planning on participating in MOUD treatment, and the inability to produce a urine sample positive for bup prior to randomization indicates this is probably not going to be a good candidate for the study. Now note that this applies only to candidates who are taking a transmucosal formulation of bup alone. Someone who is receiving injections of the XR formulation, even if they are also taking some transmucosal as supplement, will not be required to produce a positive urine drug screen. For those participants who initially screen negative for bup, additional urine drug screens may be tested to see if there is a positive screen before the end of the screening. Sites should not schedule baseline and randomization until a positive UDS is obtained. Now let's look at how this plays out on the treatment and research status form. Sites will complete the urine drug screen prior to completion of the TRS. Participants who are prescribed transmucosal buprenorphine must have at least one UDS result positive for BUP during the screening segment. In the event that multiple screening UDSs are required in order to obtain a positive result for BUP, the RA should save the TRS-ECRF without completing question 5B and proceed with the screening visit. Once the positive urine drug screen for BUP is obtained and entered into eClinical, the RA should return to the screening TRS-ECRF to resave the form with the auto-populated urine drug screen results for BUP in question 5A. If the participant is prescribed at least one injectable BUP formulation, question 5A on the TRS will be auto-populated to not applicable, and the question 5B will be expected and available for data entry. Now let's look at the change to exclusion criterion number 9, which says, have a history of suicide attempts in the prior year. Now originally, this criterion read, have a history of suicide attempts, period. Several study sites have reported that the current lifetime exclusion has prevented enrollment of otherwise eligible participants. And again, on the ENRC form, you can see the changes to the language in criterion number 15 from does the individual have a history of suicide attempts to does the individual have a history of suicide attempts in the prior year. This change was also reflected on the PRISM. Previously, question 5 had a prompt that an answer of present was associated with an autofill of yes on question 15 of the ENRC, and that would render the participant ineligible. As we are no longer looking at lifetime suicidal behavior, that autofill has been moved to question 8, which has added in the prior year. A yes to this question will result in an autofill of yes to question 15 on the ENRC and render the participant ineligible. This update also affects the medical and psychiatric history form. Language clarifying that the history of suicide attempts is only relevant if in the prior year has been added to question 11 in the eligibility section. So this eligibility criterion change is going to be very helpful for recruitment, but given what the FDA said initially, how are we able to do this? Well, this change is in response to the recent FDA request to remove the suicidal behavior and ideation warning from GLP-1 receptor agonists, which include tirzepatide products. In July 2023, after receiving some post-marketing reports of suicidal ideation and behavior in patients taking GLP-1 medications, the FDA initiated further investigation of the potential risk for suicidal ideation and behavior for GLP-1 medications. The initial review of GLP-1 clinical trial data did not find an association between the use of GLP-1s and the occurrence of suicidal ideation or behavior. They then performed a meta-analysis of clinical trials that were part of the drug development phase to assess the risk of suicidal ideation and behavior, comparing GLP-1s to placebo. Next, the FDA conducted a retrospective study of healthcare claims data. And finally, they reviewed published observational and pooled studies evaluating the relationship between GLP-1s and suicidal ideation and behavior. These extensive reviews did not identify an increased risk of suicidal behavior or ideation with the use of GLP-1 medications. Therefore, the FDA released a memo in January requesting that application holders remove the associated risk language. Given the new FDA guidance, our original criterion was unnecessarily restrictive. So this modified criterion will help to ensure safety while not ruling out people unnecessarily. Now let's look at the changes in the section on managing dose increases. The protocol has been updated to specify that participants must receive 4 injections of a given dose before a dose increase is considered. If an injection is missed, the potential escalation is delayed until 4 doses have been administered. Now, you may remember that all participants will be scheduled for a dose increase at week 5 unless there is clinical concern to that. We are adding the caveat that we are also not scheduling that dose increase if they missed a dose during the first 4 weeks. Now, this criterion does not require that the 4 injections be received in consecutive weeks. It just needs to be a total of 4 of the current dose before an increase can be considered. Now let's look at the changes in the information around study medication discontinuation. The updated protocol clarifies that the decision to discontinue study medication will be made by a blinded site study physician only after consultation with the lead team. Similar clarification language was made to the section discussing the decision to withdraw a participant from the study. In addition, previously the protocol only allowed medication restart if the participant's BMI dropped below 18.5, but then subsequently increased to 20.0 BMI. The amendment adds the opportunity for a medication restart if a participant was discontinued due to inadequate birth control, but then subsequently returned to using adequate birth control. In both cases, the participant would restart the medication at the lowest dose based on the clinical judgment of the blinded study physician. We also made some updates to the language around the key study roles. Now, we've already talked about these in previous meetings, but just for your information, these are the main changes that happened in that section. Under the blinded medical clinician, we clarified that at least one blinded medical clinician must be a physician. Under the pharmacy role, we clarified that if a unblinded medical clinician is managing the medications, a refrigerated storage area must be available to them. And then finally, for the QMHP role, we clarified that this role should be blinded unless there is some emergent safety concern that would require an unblinding or the use of an unblinded medical clinician. As noted earlier, we also made some clarification to some study assessment descriptions. The first of these is that the CHRT-CR, or the CC2, will also be performed for a participant who scores in the range of possible depression, that is, total depression score of 8 or higher, or anxiety, total anxiety score of 8 or higher, on the Hospital Anxiety and Depression Scale, or the HADS. Finally, the CHRT-CR will be performed for a participant who reports suicidal ideation on the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, or the PHQ-9 as well. As in past research, naloxone or emergency medical care, such as an ED visit or hospitalization, to intervene is required for a reported overdose to be scored as an overdose. An overdose meeting this criterion will be collected as an SAE as well. On the GSRS, we just clarified that it would be completed as outlined in the assessment table. And on the medical and psychiatric history, we clarified that the suicide is due to past year only, and the medical history must be countersigned by a physician if it is performed by a non-physician. We also made some updates to the statistics section that expanded the clarification of the primary outcome measure, clarified the secondary outcome measure, the primary objective, expanded the clarification of the key secondary outcome, and clarified the secondary outcome measure. Then we did quite a bit of expansion on the section regarding significance testing. So what are our next steps? Well, in the CTN, each time there's an updated protocol and/or informed consent, all site and node staff must review the updated documents and sign the review logs indicating they have done so. In this case, the site PI will also need to sign the investigator signature page for version 3.0. The lead team has provided a list of changes to assist you. Once signed, those logs and the investigator signature page will be returned to the lead node and to the Clinical Coordinating Center, and they will be maintained in your site regulatory binder. In addition, the prime level submission includes updates to the informed consent document, which removes suicidal ideation from the risks section. This will need to be handled at the site level as well. Ben will handle these edits for sites, reaching out as necessary. Thank you for joining me for this walkthrough of changes due to the new protocol version 3.0.